Welcome to the Monroe County Historical Association's monthly Third Thursday lecture series. My name is Amy Leiser and I'm the Executive Director, and I'm very happy to introduce tonight's speakers. Michael Mancuso and Eric J. Kerchner will give a presentation based off of their very popular book, Etna, A Murder Out of Time, which examines the unsolved murder of 17-year-old Etna Bittenbender of Hamilton Township in 1880. 140 years after the vicious murder of the daughter of a local family, Mancuso and Kerchner team up to solve this coldest of cases. By using the techniques, methods, and insights acquired over the course of their careers, they pursue the crime in all its details, recognizing the limitations and failings of the original investigators, uncovering leads long ago forgotten, and using the passage of the years to connect suspects to the crime. Their mission is to fulfill a centuries-old mandate issued by a grand jury directing their predecessors to, quote, use all resources to ferret out the murder of Etna Bittenbender. Michael Mancuso is the first assistant for the Monroe County District Attorney, specializing in the investigation and prosecution of murder and suspicious death cases. Mr. Mancuso has worked on hundreds of investigations, bringing to verdict nearly 50 murder defendants. Eric J. Kerchner is the chief of the Monroe County District Attorney's Criminal Investigations Division, with more than 40 years of experience as a law enforcement professional. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome Michael and Eric, who will give us their presentation, Etna, A Murder Out of Time. Welcome, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Welcome, Amy.
Thanks for having us, Amy. Really appreciate it. That was a great introduction.
Well, we're very excited to hear this tale. I did read your book and thoroughly enjoyed it, so this is going to be a really great evening. Thank you again. Oh, and I should mention, if anybody has any questions, to please go ahead and use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your questions, and at the end of the presentation I'll be happy to ask them.
Okay.
The screen is all yours, guys. Take it away.
Thank you. Just by way of quick background, this all started as I was getting familiar with some of the county history. We do a lot of cold cases, unfortunately, in the DA's office, and talking to some of the old timers, they would mention this case, but never by name, never with any precise details. I started digging a little bit and I found out the scene of the crime was very close to my daily commute to work every day. And I had teamed up with Eric. I had asked him if he was willing to dig in on our spare time. This was back in 2012. And he said yes, and off we went. Several visits to your place and all other spots in the county and beyond. And we kind of had a great deal of material and we needed to get it out there. So we were very privileged to have the opportunity to do this, and we hope you enjoy it and save the good questions for the end. But if you haven't read the book, we don't want to give up too much because there's a lot of twists and turns, and it faced the original investigators and it was like a roller coaster for them. So we don't want to take away that experience by giving too much away. So, okay.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. All right.
Yeah. Thank you.
We'll start with slide number 2.
Her name was Etna, the oldest daughter of Samuel and Margaret Bittenbender. She was barely 17 years old. She was born and raised in Hamilton Township. She was last seen alive in the late afternoon on October 31st, 1880, leaving her parents' farm and heading to the home of a Jacob Marsh, where she was employed keeping house.
Now, this portrait of this young girl is not actually Etna Bittenbender. This is based on contemporary sources. This woman would have definitely looked like Etna. Bittenbender, by the way, is German. It means barrel maker. And Etna was the oldest in her family of the females, the second oldest child, the oldest female. And this captures her long black hair. It was described in a lot of the news accounts as jet black. And she was tall for the time and the era. She was very stylish. And to quote some of the sources, she was quite the belle of her section. Very, very popular. Her funeral was the most attended in the county's history up until that point.
On Monday, November 1st, 1880, around 8 in the morning, 45-year-old Emma Marsh pensively looked out of her kitchen window towards the schoolhouse next door. It was a cool, crisp morning, the temperature barely exceeding 40 degrees.
Now, this is a map of a portion of Hamilton Township, the portion that interests us. It's from, I think, the Beers map, which is at the county archives. And what you should be looking at down in this direction would be Snydersville. And this is today's Pencil Creek Road traveling up there. In Etna's day, it was only known as a public road. This is the Sand Hill section near the Marsh Foundry. You would continue up the hill in a northwesterly direction. And this is our area of interest right here. You can see the word school and a little black box, and then the name J.B. Marsh. That is Jacob Bittenbender Marsh, and his house was right alongside the school. And then you'll see over here another little black box that's representing the residence of A. France. And circa 1875, the property here was in the name of Mr. France. Around 1877, Samuel Bittenbender purchased the farm, and that's where the family was living at the time of the murder. So the area of interest then would be the roadway, which today is called Smiley Lane, that goes down to the Pencil Creek Road. And this little curve in the road is actually a bridge that's no longer in existence. It was washed away in 1955, but that was the way to get to the school and get to the house of Mr. Marsh from that direction. There was also a shortcut across the fields, through a patch of woods, down the hill to the road. And then you'd go across the Little McMichaels, which is today Neola Creek, up a hill, and you can also go to school. And we were able to find on an aerial map from October of 1938, a well-worn path to the school at the time. The school itself was open until 1955, I believe. But Etna's body would be found right around the bend of the road, right in that section there where I'm putting the cursor. Okay.
November 1st was actually the first day of the school year. Emma Marsh was waiting for the younger Bittenbender children to arrive at school that morning. Their oldest sister, Etna, had been keeping house for Mrs. Marsh. The families were very friendly. Sam Bittenbender and Emma's husband, Jacob Marsh, were cousins.
Yeah, they were actually first cousins. And in this photo of Emma, I believe Mr. Marsh is pictured behind her amongst the other family photos. Jacob Marsh died shortly after the murder in December of 1881, and he's buried just down the road from his old homestead at a small cemetery called St. John's. This photo is actually from the Rapid City area of South Dakota, where Emma eventually moved out west to be with two of her sons, Wilson Marsh and Corbin Marsh. Around the time of the murder, Mrs. Marsh would have been in her early 40s.
Etna had been staying with the Marsh family. That Sunday, she decided to visit her parents for the day. She told Mrs. Marsh that she was only going to spend the day and would be returning by the evening. Mrs. Marsh became concerned when she woke up that morning and realized that Etna had not returned. Mrs. Marsh wanted to ask the children if Etna had decided to stay overnight at their parents' home.
The photograph up now is the area of where the homestead of Jacob Bittenbender Marsh would be. I actually did find a black and white photo pertaining to the Marsh family of at least an outbuilding, but this structure itself was gone by the early 1920s. And eventually there was a commercial establishment, an actual paint factory located here. But like I said before, the school stayed open until the 1950s. In Etna's day, it would have been painted yellow or gray or a combination of the two. And it was known as the Reese School. Emma Marsh's maiden name was Reese, and she was related to a colonial era family, one of whom was a Colonel Reese, who served in a Northampton County militia regiment. Okay.
As the Bittenbender children approached the schoolhouse, Emma leaned out the window and asked the oldest girl if she knew where Etna was. The girl replied that she thought Etna was with Mrs. Marsh, that she had left yesterday to return to the Marsh residence. Mrs. Marsh asked when Etna left, and the girls replied in the late afternoon. At that point, Emma told the children that Etna had not come back. The children told Mrs. Marsh that they had to hurry back home to tell their parents.
This photo, we couldn't find the original, and we tried. We went to the Pocono Record, and by the way, their archives are not in good order. We weren't able to find the original. It was donated by Gary F. Spriggle, who passed away quite some time ago. It's circa 1950, but it is of 60 years before that. So based on that estimate and several of the children being Etna's siblings, we would estimate it to be around 1890. Her sisters are all here, and they're Jenny, Anna, and the oldest is Alta, the girl there. And I think there's also Peter, the youngest boy of the Bittenbender family. They had 12 children in all, is also in the back row. This is the schoolhouse, the Reese School itself. The clothing is still typical even of 10 years before in 1880 or so. And in the book, we do point out an interesting connection made to the style of clothing that two of Etna's sisters are wearing to, and you do this every once in a while in a cold case, images that were relayed to us by a psychic that we had at the scene.
The children began to run back, but not exactly the way they came. Instead of running back on the road that they had walked up from, they ran down to the stream, taking a shortcut they knew well. At the stream, the kids hopped over it using stones strategically placed by others over the years. Besides, there was very little rainfall that autumn, so the water was but a trickle of its usual flow. The children climbed up the opposite bank, crossing a narrow field. What they saw next would stay seared in their minds for the rest of their lives. At the edge of the narrow field, there was a stone fence separating the field from the road. Lying on the ground near the fence and the road was the battered body of their sister Etna. So fearfully was her head and skull battered, with blood and brains scattered about on the ground and stones, that the children thought she had been shot in the head.
The photo up on the screen is a section of Pencil Creek Road near the intersection with Smiley Lane. There are remains of stone fences throughout the area. This stretch itself is interesting because the field itself is lower than the level of the road, and that seemed to be the case back then as well, based on accounts. And Etna's body would have lied against the stone fence just below the level of the road. In fact, the investigators were really hard pressed to figure out how long her body had lain there, because several persons, including her uncle and her dad, passed by early that morning with wagons and did not notice her.
The girls started back to inform their parents when, to their horror, they found their murdered sister lying in a fence corner by the side of the public road. They ran home and told their father that their sister was shot. He immediately ran to the scene and found his daughter had been most cruelly murdered. And
that is actually a quote from the Reading Eagle edition, November 5th, 1880, entitled Monroe County Horror. And for the children to think that their sister had been shot, the description of the crime scene was very, very graphic. Even in the accounts of the day, this one small blurb here, which was out the same day as the section that Eric just read, her head was pounded to a jelly, was the phrase they used then. The details of an autopsy were also published in the Jeffersonian Republican on November 4th, 1880.
Near the body was a club about 3 feet in length with a knot on its end. The club was broken in half, but it glistened in the morning light with blood and brain. There were strands of the girl's long black hair stuck to the bloody club. There was also a pointed stone coated in blood lying next to the body. The autopsy performed by Dr. Muchler of Stroudsburg, along with Dr. Levering of Hamilton Township, showed at least half a dozen death blows to Etna's skull had penetrated down to the brain. The doctors also noted signs of outrage, that is rape, on the body. There were other injuries to the body as well, injuries that led reporters to write that her body bore signs of a dreadful struggle. The body was cool to the touch, but there was no sign of rigor mortis.
This is a rendering prepared for us by Trooper John Bailey of the Forensic Services Unit of the Pennsylvania State Police, and now with the crime room in Stroudsburg Barracks. And he was kind enough to look at the old accounts and the description of the road. And we also had an old photograph, which you'll see up shortly, from the 1940s by a William Lesh, taken of the crime scene area. So we were able to use that, and I mentioned an earlier aerial photograph from 1938 to show the countryside was a lot more open than it is today, less overgrown, but the hillside that Etna would have walked down was wooded back then, as it still is today. The drawing would show broken pieces of a club and the sharpened stone with blood on it as well. This is a close view, also prepared by Trooper Bailey with the pieces of club. The club itself was described in the coroner's inquest at about 3 feet in length. This was a photograph given to us by the present occupants of the Bittenbender homestead. They had it there. It was on a postcard circa 1946, and it was described as the Shale Top Farm. The countryside even then was a lot more open than it is now. This whole area now is well-to-do houses in a development. I think it's Dragon Eye Court or something like that. This is the Bittenbender farmhouse itself. The crime scene would have been in this direction, as well as the path Etna would have taken that day.
Efforts to reconstruct Etna's steps from her parents' farm to the Marsh residence revealed that Etna took a shortcut across her father's fields and onto a path that wound through a piece of woods down to the road. Just inside the woods, bordering her father's fields, the investigators saw the first traces of blood. Etna was attacked as soon as she entered the woods.
The photograph up here is the farmhouse as it appears today. There's still some cool outbuildings, which clearly are also from Etna's time, including a very, very old stone barn, which was kind of cool to look at. And we were given permission to walk the property and behind the property. And even though Detective Kerchner doesn't like the outdoors, he bore up with it well.
Etna left the Bittenbender farm around 4 p.m. She traveled through the orchards and fields of the very productive 200-plus acre farm, arriving at its wooded border on the side of the hill, just overlooking the northern edge of today's Pencil Creek Road. The well-worn path then cut through the woods, exiting down onto the road.
This is at the edge of the what would have been the Bittenbender fields, and it's a very well-established stone fence with a gap in it. And it would have been this gap that lines up real nice with the original path that Etna would have taken that day. So I can't say these are the same trees, are not as old as 140 years, but it would have been right in this area as she left her father's fields that she would have been set upon, almost like someone or some people were lying in wait for her.
The scene where Etna's body lay perplexed the investigators. There was a reckless element to the location. It was the opposite of well hidden. The sight distance up and down the road in question was over 60 yards. The road was fairly busy, connecting the towns of Snydersville and Sand Hill with Neola, also called Woodville, and readers. In fact, a number of people traveled by the spot where Etna's body was found, and they failed to see her. These included people on the road the night before, as well as her own father and her Uncle George that very morning. The investigators began to wonder whether Etna was decoyed, concealed nearby for a time until she was taken to the road and killed.
And that was one of the main attentions in the early investigation, because that would have been a very, very bold, brazen thing to do. And that, combined with the blood trail showing Etna was attacked as soon as she went in the woods, led people to believe that maybe somebody local to the area who knew of the girl's travels or plans was responsible for her murder. The photographs here are side by side, the same section of road, today Pencil Creek Road, and as it appeared circa 1946, when Mr. What was his name again?
Oh, I can't remember.
The fellow who wrote the, it'll come to me. He did a nice photo booklet, Landmarks of Hamilton Township. And in that booklet, he had a couple pictures of what the crime scene looked like in his day. And he also wrote an article about the details that were known to him. His family does come up in the book because one of the oral traditions we found actually laid the blame for the killing on his younger brother, Joseph. But this was the area much more open than it is today, and could see well up and down the road. So if the murder took place where the body was found, which the investigators assumed, it was a daring thing and a very bold thing, a depraved thing.
The inquest held by Justice of the Peace Eugene Marsh of Sand Hill was the official investigation into the murder. Inquests are still used today. For example, we are currently working with Coroner Yannick on several suspicious death cases. The club and stones used to murder Etna were identified and examined. The intent to kill was clear. An autopsy performed by lead physician Dr. John Muchler showed multiple fatal blows penetrated Etna's skull. The body bore signs of a terrible struggle. The official motive for the crime recorded in the inquest resulted from being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil. The doctors found that Etna had been raped. However, on that point, they did not make their findings public. The identity of the guilty was declared to be unknown.
The two photographs displayed here on the screen are of Scioto as they appeared in Etna's time. I think both these buildings are still there. One of these two, and there was a hotel, and I think it was called the Levering Hotel at the time, which Levering was the doctor's family of one of the doctors who performed the autopsy, would have been a location where they held the inquest back then. An inquest is something that's rarely used today, although in my experience, we've actually used it several times. It's a good way of getting information quickly on a suspicious death, that sort of thing. And that was really the only process that was available to the investigators early on in Etna's day. It required the justice of the peace, even though it's called a coroner's inquest, the justice of the peace summoning 6 good and lawful men of the county and swearing them in on the spot of where the body is found. They call that in visum corporis, in sight of the body. And at that point, once they confirmed that the victim was deceased, they would adjourn to another location and they would begin to take evidence concerning what happened. And they could have gone as far as to name a perpetrator and even to swear out an arrest warrant. But unfortunately, the investigation at that point did not yield enough clues to charge anyone at that time. This is an actual photograph of the inquest itself. That's the entirety of it. It was actually filed in early December of 1880 by Justice of the Peace Marsh. And the men who would have served on the jury, Huffner, Dunbar, Barry, Featherman, for instance, they're all listed there as well. And the language about being born by the instigation of the devil is actually language that was recognized in the law at the time for things such as a willful, deliberate, and premeditated murder.
The effect of the brutal crime upon the community was profound. Over 1,000 mourners attended Etna's funeral at Christ Hamilton Church. Fear gripped the people. Many turned to religion for solace. One of them was the wife of juror B.F. Barry and the sister of the presiding justice of the peace, Eugene Marsh.
Yeah, it's important to remember when you're dealing with this time period, according to the 1880 census, Monroe County population was 20,000. If you count all the names listed for Hamilton Township that same year, you get almost 2,000 people. So many of the people were related. It was very tight knit. Most of the people in Hamilton Township were farmers, but there were quite a few trades represented. There were a lot of small industries as well, including the Marsh Foundry, where Eugene Marsh and his brother worked. Their dad had actually founded the foundry. But this poem is a very sad one. We're told it was set to a tune like Home Sweet Home. And Miss Mary Barry and her husband, who was serving on the jury, they're both buried at the Hamilton Cemetery, just outside of Snydersville. Do you want to read the poem?
You think?
Sure.
'Twas on a Sunday evening, the autumn winds did blow. A patch of woods lay on her way, through which she had to go. And what was lurking in those woods, the poor girl, she did not know. She said, "This path is lonely, but I venture through. There is nothing there to harm me. My heart is young and true." A cruel thought deceived her, a girl so young and fair, for a fiend more cursed than Satan soon had her in the snare. In vain she cried, "O father and mother, do come near. My anguish is so very great, much more I cannot bear." No father or companion came, no helping hand was near. The torture of this dreadful work the lonely girl must bear. And then she called on Jesus' name alone, and her request granted, he saved her by his love. And now she rests in paradise in that bright land so fair. No wicked man can harm her more, no sin can enter there.
And the sentiment that's in here, especially the torture of this dreadful work the lonely girl must bear, was part of that tension in the investigation of when and where she was actually killed. What happened, how long it had taken. Was it right around the time of her disappearance, or was she decoyed to another place, raped, tortured, as they put in the song and the poem here? So that was something that you see back and forth as you read the accounts of the investigation and what phase they were in. And it all had to do with whether the perpetrator or perpetrators were local or whether they were drifters, tramps as they were called back then. And this is the site of Etna's funeral, the Christ Hamilton Church. Eric and I went there, very helpful. They were showing us the records they had. But it was kind of a terrible thing. The Reverend at the time left out a whole chunk of his congregation's history, did not record weddings, funerals, births. So we were really deprived of that information of Etna's family who attended this church. And that would have been of a period that would have stretched from Etna's birth through a year or two after her death.
Among the information found out was that on Halloween evening, Reverend Gilbert of the Methodist Church in Neola was driving his carriage down what is today Greenview Drive. He passed within a couple hundred yards of the crime scene. He testified he heard sounds of a young girl being whipped. However, he made no investigation because he claimed to believe that a family lived down there, and he was wrong.
Yeah, the Reverend was a 26-year-old, married with one child. He was actually from Connecticut, and I think that was his first year at this little church. That's a picture of the Neola Church close in time to Etna's day. Interestingly, that church was actually moved about 10 years before Etna's death. It originally stood like one street over, I believe across from a cemetery, which is still there in Neola. I'm not sure why they moved it, but the photograph shows it was a very small congregation. The area itself, it would have been down in a hollow that the Reverend was passing over on the road, and it would have been dark at that point in time, November. It would have been after 6 p.m. So one wonders what he actually heard. Was that Etna? Was Etna being violated, abused, tortured at that time? And how long did that go on? And that kind of got the investigators thinking too. The condition of the body, although cool to the touch, did not bear signs of rigor mortis. And they knew back then what that was. And they knew typically when it forms, when it reaches its full, complete nature, and when it begins to subside. So they were very troubled by this information from Reverend Gilbert.
D.S. Lee was the elected district attorney. He was serving his third and final term. He was active in the investigation. He called and questioned witnesses at the inquest. He was behind the hiring of the Pinkerton Detective Agency to help find the killer. He authorized several arrests and over a dozen people detained at various times during the investigation. Yet the killer was never found out, and the case grew cold and eventually forgotten.
Yeah, David Stokes Lee, it's Stokes, not Stoker. That's my typo. Was a Civil War veteran. He was a school teacher originally. He taught in Mauchunk, Jim Thorpe today. And then he moved back to Stroudsburg after he started apprentice for the law. They called it a preceptor back then. He did real well in the law. He was considered a gifted advocate. He was one of the defense attorneys for one of the defendants in the Broadhead case. He eventually was elected in hotly contested elections involving several candidates as district attorney. Avid baseball player. Every once in a while, he might have hit the bottle a little hard. He was on a probationary status at his church, the Methodist Church here in Stroudsburg, because of a little problem with being under the influence of alcohol. But he seemed to have been a character. Afterwards, he was voted out of office after the murder, the following election. He was the lowest vote getter of the three running. But about 10 years later, he made it to the state Senate, became a state senator, and he practiced law up until the day of his death in, I believe, 1908.
Detective Wood was one of the Pinkertons' best men. He was a patient, hardworking guy who embodied all qualities of a good detective. He was dispatched and arrived in Monroe County by Thursday, November 4th, the day Etna's body was laid to rest in Mount Zion Cemetery in Hamilton Township. Detective Wood worked throughout November and into December of 1880. He developed multiple leads, conducted dozens of interviews, arranged for witness identification of suspects, forensically examined evidence, and placed an undercover agent in the jail as a plant to try and elicit confessions from at least one suspect.
Yeah, John S. Wood, he's mentioned in this newspaper article. We found a lot of information about Detective Wood and his career at the Pinkertons. He definitely was one of the best Pinkerton agents out of their New York office, which was based in Brooklyn at the time. Detective Wood was keen on what today we would call trace evidence. He made a point of visiting the crime scene himself. He found remains of what were called a tramp camp. He found hemlock boughs that were cut with a knife that had to have a notch in its blade. He found other trace evidence. He was very early on of the belief that the killer or killers were not from the area. They were outsiders. And that was the original impetus for the tramp theory, as they called it back then. Detective Wood eventually, though, was pulled off the case. We couldn't find him working on the case after the end of December of 1880. We don't believe that resources for Detective Wood were in place after that date. We weren't able to find any payments to the Pinkertons after that date. Detective Wood was so good that he went on his own, developed a detective agency that did quite well, but then died suddenly on the day after Christmas in 1894. His widow would outlive him by over 30 years, and he's buried today in his home town up in Cayuga, New York. But his files, all his cases, are no longer in the Pinkerton archives, and the researchers there were at a loss to tell us what happened to them. Our theory is that he kept them when he opened up his own agency, but we've been unable to confirm that.
Attorney Holmes was a gifted trial lawyer and had been district attorney before D.S. Lee. Out of frustration with the lack of progress and fear the guilty would never face justice, Etna's family hired Mr. Holmes in early 1881. Mr. Holmes was specifically looking into certain men then confined to the Eastern State Penitentiary for crimes committed shortly after the murder in nearby communities such as Whitehaven and Portland, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Stephen Holmes was originally from Maine and then came down to Monroe County and was a very gifted lawyer and a former district attorney. And we were lucky enough to find a letter he had written on behalf of his client, Samuel Bittenbender, to the prison authorities at the Eastern State Penitentiary, looking for permission to interview some of the inmates there and asking that certain items of evidence that were collected in a murder-suicide at the jail in 1881 be preserved.
The question entered the minds of the investigators almost immediately. Who did this? One theory was that outsiders, known as tramps, drifters, were responsible. This was referred to as the tramp theory. Certainly, the news accounts of the time were filled with reports of crimes committed by these drifters all across the country. Tramps could be dangerously criminal, were frequently suspects, and occasionally scapegoats.
Scapegoats. Not a scapegoat, but that's good. That's all right. I'm only kidding. Tramps were conveniently picked on when these types of cases happened. If you read the accounts all over the country, you start getting similar themes. Could this be the work of tramps? And sometimes it was, and sometimes it wasn't. There was legislation in Pennsylvania passed right around the time of the murder, the Tramp Act, which enhanced certain penalties and defined who tramps are. There was a very popular handgun offered for sale known as the Tramp Terror. So tramps were real. At this time period, there were a lot of displaced, landless drifters, men traveling the countryside, and a lot of mischief attributed to them.
There was evidence to support the tramp theory. Two tramps were seen in the morning of November 1st, 1880, lurking on a nearby bridge. Also near the scene of the crime, evidence of a tramp camp was found in the woods. The evidence included bedding made of hemlock boughs arranged near an unlit campfire. Also, branches and leaves of a sumac bush had been gathered. Both the hemlock and the sumac were cut by a knife, which had a notch in the blade.
There were at least 3 bridges in proximity to the crime scene back in 1880. One of them is still there. It's the one in Sand Hill. The other one right by the crime scene would have been only yards away, basically. That's been washed away. And then from the news accounts, it appeared that the bridge depicted in this photo, the remains of the bridge depicted in this photo would have been the one. It actually is along Effort Neola Road. It looks like the roadway had a different course than it does today, at least for a brief stretch. And the old bridge being of stone, it's a similar time period of Etna's era. So the tramp theory was born out of the sighting of 2 tramps, quote unquote, lurking about this bridge. And that would have been the morning of the murder.
A description of the men was sent out to all points by telegraph, and eventually a reward was offered. Sheriff Baker of Monroe County offered $200 for the apprehension of the killer or killers. The citizens of Hamilton Township raised another $900. Today's equivalent would be approximately $30,000. Many arrests were made throughout the region, and efforts to trace the activities of the arrested men took place. It was time-consuming, tedious work, but did not yield the identity of the killer.
Yeah, the tramp theory took a lot of resources because all of the surrounding communities, the authorities were on notice to look out for suspicious persons, and they were just arrested first, and then efforts to identify them and to trace their whereabouts were made. And a lot of times it included searching the contents of what they had on them. And there are several news accounts of tramps being apprehended with knives on them, and several of the knives had notches in their blade. So then what would happen would be the witness who had seen the two tramps would be transported up to the area. It could be Wilkes-Barre, it could be Scranton, it could be Easton, wherever it might be, to see if they can identify the tramps. All of these in the end proved fruitless, and all the attempts to trace the tramps did not yield up the guilty party. There was a reward, as Eric mentioned. The reward was also put in the papers. This is the reward issued by Sheriff Baker, who lived at the old jail on what was the third floor back then. It's not there anymore, with his wife. The two tramps, the description given, fairly detailed: 5'10", 180, 40 years of age, brown hair. Did not see a beard, but may have one. Gray sack coat, pants like the coat, and black soft hat. Second man, 5'7", weight 150, 30 to 35 years old, smooth face, light colored clothes, had on a cap, think it used to be dark blue. If seen in circumstances warrant, arrest and hold them and notify William T. Baker, Stroudsburg.
But there were some who doubted the tramp theory. The timing of the crime bothered them the most. They believed that the killer or killers had to be knowledgeable of Etna and her movements. In other words, a local. This theory came to be known as the local theory. Those who supported the local theory believed that the killer must have known the plans of the murdered girl. The killer would then be able to time his assault upon Etna by hiding in the woods along the path she was going to take.
Depicted on the screen is a close-up of a family portrait. This is a fellow named Sam Haney. He would have been 34 at the time of the murder. This photograph is after that date. Sam Haney was arrested, we believe, 3 times for the murder of Etna Bittenbender. And each time, after hearing, he was discharged. It got to the point where the local newspaper, the Jeffersonian Republican, really went to town on the authorities, castigating them, calling it amateur detective bungling, pointing out that the calmest person in the courtroom was Mr. Haney himself, who everybody is saying nothing but hearsay talk about, ascribing to him all kinds of evil deeds. But anytime someone is put to the task to say whether they heard it firsthand or not, or they had anything but hearsay evidence, the cases turned out to be a fizzle. So Sam Haney eventually was let go the third and final time. He lived the rest of his life, eventually passing away in the early 1900s, 1914, I believe, in East Stroudsburg, but not before he was charged with rape, fathering a young girl, the victim, a 18-year-old from Tannersville. The trial was considered so inflammatory in its details that it was not fit to print the details, and it was standing room only. And after a lengthy trial, Sam Haney was acquitted of rape. He was one of the local suspects under the local theory. His house would have stood less than a mile from the crime scene, just outside of today what is called Sand Hill, and I believe it still stands on the side of Pencil Creek Road.
In March of 1881, at Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary, a young man named Frank Pfeiffer from New York, but serving a sentence for burglary out of Luzerne County, murdered his cellmate, then hung himself. Pfeiffer left a barely comprehensible note etched on a writing slate, which may have referred to Etna. No follow-up appears to have been undertaken by the authorities.
Yeah, the Frank Pfeiffer situation, and here is a excerpt from his inmate record at Eastern State Penitentiary. Inmate number 728, it was actually A728, 23-year-old. Here it's spelled Pfeiffer, but the actual spelling would be Pfeifer, Pfeiffer. And he was the son of German immigrants from Hesse in Germany, who settled in New York. And he had done quite a few crimes despite his young age in New York, and was on the lam when he was arrested in Whitehaven following some burglaries there, along with a cousin of his living in Carbon County at the time, a 17-year-old named George Kraft. So in the writings, Frank, after he killed his cellmate, the inmates used to communicate to the guards on little pieces of slate with writing pencils. Mentioned he also killed that girl in Jackson County, and that created a sensation. And efforts were made to figure out if they could connect Pfeiffer or Kraft with Monroe County, and in particular with Etna Bittenbender.
In December of 1880, a torn and bloody coat was found buried near the scene. Long strands of hair were found on the coat. The coat was identified as belonging to Jacob Marsh's 16-year-old son, Wilson. Although nearly caught by a mob and lynched, young Wilson made his way to Stroudsburg and successfully explained the circumstances to the authorities, who cleared him of any wrongdoing.
This is a photograph, a close-up of a family photo of Wilson Marsh. Here it looks like he's in his 30s. He would have been 16 at the time of the murder. He would have been a second cousin to Etna Bittenbender. He eventually settles in the Rapid City, South Dakota area, and becomes a pioneer rancher, an expert at irrigating fields, very well-to-do, a real pioneer in that community. Wilson seems to have been a bright kid. He also seems to be the one who started the tramp theory by seeing the tramps on the bridge and identifying them, the ones that no one could find after that. So suspicion really fell on Wilson, to the point where he was almost lynched, according to the articles. But give him credit, he came on his own to Stroudsburg. He had some friends of his with him, and even the people who found the coat. And he was able to convince the authorities that he threw that coat down hunting several weeks before the murder. And he didn't know where it was since. And something about his story seemed to click, because he was cleared, and even the local papers had said he was no longer suspected of any involvement. And this brings up kind of an unsettling part of justice back then. The threat of lynching, especially in horrible cases like this, was quite real. Right around the investigation into the murder of Etna Bittenbender, there was a lynching that occurred of a young man named George Snyder, right over the border in Northampton County for killing a farmer and his wife, and he had been a farmhand. And that lynching occurred while the coroner's inquest was taking place in the house where the murdered couple's bodies lay.
In February 1881, a group of young girls returning from church in Jackson Township one evening were attacked by half a dozen young men and boys. The girls were assaulted. One had her dress torn off. Their screams alerted farmers nearby, who chased the culprits away. The public was enraged, and a connection between the attack and Etna's murder was suspected.
And this is an article from the Bethlehem Times that details the attack that happened back in February of 1881. And it really got people fired up, as you could imagine. And it does point to the fact that one of the young men or boys had previously been suspected. in the murder of the Bittenbender girl, but nothing could be proved against him. So the illusion there all seems to point to Wilson Marsh. We were able to look at the courthouse records, the grand jury proceedings. Now, grand juries are secret, but there was a presentment issued which directed the district attorney to determine the circumstances of this attack. And in particular, they named one of the girls who was 18 at the time of the attack. In particular, the daughter of so-and-so, the father, to find out who did it to her and if there was a connection. But there seems to have been no progress with this for whatever reason. But right around that time, the murder-suicide involving Frank Pfeiffer would have happened. That would have been in March of 1881, less than a month later.
Sam and Margaret grew old, died, and were buried alongside their murdered oldest daughter. The case slipped from living memory and over time was all but forgotten, relegated to folk memory, a mere ghost story until now.
And this is the headstone, Etna's headstone, which was carved by another Bittenbender. I think Ira was his name. They were distant relations. And it's kind of poignant in that it tells us she was murdered by some person unknown. And not only that, but exactly when they say it happened. Sunday evening, October 31st, 1880, between the hours of 4 and 6 o'clock. And then the traditional laurel leaves and rosettes signifying eternal life and that sort of thing. And that's where the case had remained, all but forgotten.
Come with us to another time as we journey through the darkest inner recesses of the human soul to fulfill a mandate handed down by a long-gone grand jury over 140 years ago, directing the district attorney to use every resource to ferret out the murder of Etna Bittenbender. And
this is just the cover of the book. Again, this was a creation of Trooper Bailey, who used to be a commercial artist back in the day. And we were looking at something to capture the mood, and a murder out of time seemed to fit, and the broken hourglass seemed to be symbolic of several different things. And then I know the last slide is something that Eric is really looking forward to, so I'll put that on next.
Etna, A Murder Out of Time, available at Carol & Carol Booksellers, Amazon, and virtualbookworms.com.
Okay, and that concludes the presentation.
Thank you guys very much. You ready for some questions?
Eric first, yes.
Okay. So it's very interesting that the murder happened on Halloween. Do you think that played a role with some of those, devil remarks that were made?
I don't believe that Halloween, that they picked Halloween night to track her down and kill her. I think that was just coincidental. I don't know what Michael thinks, though.
Well, the Halloween connection interested us early on. We wanted to know how significant Halloween was to the community back then. Most of the people ethnically were of German extraction, and we knew that Halloween was more of a Celtic in origin celebration. But it was recognized and it was celebrated in the time period. It seems that what we would term mischief night was also something that they were doing. Eric and I actually found a memory, a folk memory, for lack of a better term, that seemed to lay blame on a group of boys out Halloweening that came upon Etna, and so we explored that lead in the book. We were unable to make a connection because the suspect that was mentioned there would have only been, I think, 11 or 12 years old at the time of the murder. But it definitely was something that caused us to scratch our heads and think about it. October 31st was also at that time, we believe, the last day of school. I mean, the last day before the start of school, the first day being the day her body was found by her siblings on November 1st.
Did they physically collect the evidence from the scene, like the clubs and the stones, and or if so, are they at the county?
Well, yeah, oh, I remembered his name, William Lesh. William Lesh in his Landmarks of Monroe County tells us that everything was collected. The stones, the pieces of club, all of that was collected and preserved at the courthouse in case the suspect would ever be charged and needed for trial. Eric and I scoured the courthouse from top to bottom, all of the outbuildings associated with it, to our, I guess, disappointment. We had learned that a lot of the materials in there were kind of tossed away indiscriminately about 4 or 5 years before we were looking. In fact,
Oh.
Eric was able to save several archived district attorney's files from the dumpster, including the maps case, I believe you saved,
Right.
right? So we believe it was there for many years, but by 2004, 2005, 2006, who would recognize pieces of wood and stones and yeah. So to answer your question, yes and no.
Right,
Preserved
right.
until a time, yeah.
And it's interesting you said the Maps murder. I think, the Bittenbender and the Maps are the two, the old historic murders that we hear most about in Monroe County. So that can be your next book, right?
Well, I don't know about that. We're awfully busy all of a sudden.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
How long did the original investigation last?
The investigation really went hot and heavy from November 1st through to early January. And by that point in time, we see the families frustrated. We see Attorney Holmes is hired, and we're starting to hear about leads not even being followed up on. So I would say only the first few months following the murder. There were efforts along over the years. 1886, there was a suspect mentioned. We traced that in the book, and even as late as the 1920s, in conjunction with a missing person, there was an effort to look into the murder. But really, the core of the work was done in those first couple months.
In 1880, there was no police department. There was no Pennsylvania State Police. And that's why the county hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to come out and conduct an independent investigation. But that only took place for about 2 months. And we had tracked down the business journals of the county, and where we saw the payments made to the Pinkerton Detective Agency for the Bittenbender investigation.
It would have been very expensive for the county. In fact, the payments we saw made to the detective in those last 2 months of 1880 actually exceeded the entire year of cost for housing inmates at the county jail.
Wow. Okay, we have some other questions. Did anyone think the uncle had anything to do with the murder? Usually murders are from someone close to the person, too close to the road not to notice.
The Uncle George Bittenbender. Assuming it's George Bittenbender, he was an identical twin of Sam Bittenbender, Etna's father. George seems to have been very active in trying to find the culprit. In fact, Uncle George went to the Wilkes-Barre prison or jail to try to interview George Kraft. He went with another gentleman after an article appeared where Kraft was answering allegations that he was involved in a murder with his cousin Pfeiffer, who had killed himself. George also sent telegrams out. He owned a grocery store in Snydersville at the time of the murder. There was, in addition to Uncle George, Etna's own father passed by that spot and didn't see the body. And that was that same morning. And even the night before, up until 9 o'clock at night or so, several persons ventured down that stretch of roadway and did not see Etna there. So I'd have to conclude, no, nobody really suspected any of the Bittenbender family as doing this.
Okay, this question came in. All these questions came in certainly during your presentation. This goes back to the gentleman Haney. It's a different first name, but it does say, in your research, did you come across the name Felix Haney? He was my great-great-grandfather who attempted suicide at the corner of Pencil Creek Road. He did not succeed. The branch broke. He later committed suicide by slitting his throat in his home. He was a hex doctor, a veterinarian. His homestead was on 715 in Readers, became the Staples for the Summit. He was so crazy, his wife ran home to Elmira, New York, the day after their wedding, never to return.
I did come across the name Felix Haney. I don't know how close he was in relation to Sam. They weren't siblings. And Felix did have a criminal record. He did have a rape charge on him, which we found, I think from 1880, from the September term of court. But beyond that, we could make no connection with Felix and Sam.
Sound like interesting folks, that's for sure. Did your investigation uncover anything further after the book was written?
Well, one of the things that we were working on, we had a lead about a certain house in the Snydersville area in the late 70s, early 80s that actually had a whole room dedicated to Etna's memory, including a huge oval portrait with the initials EB under the frame. And I know it breaks Eric's heart that he failed to find that portrait, despite talking to so many people who remember seeing it. But hopefully the current owner of the residence will respond to Eric's inquiries and indicate whether he recalls seeing that when he acquired the property.
Okay, I think it's most likely it was a local or multiple, since they would have had to know the roots or even her roots specifically. It seems unlikely that an outsider would choose not to walk the road if they don't know the area.
Well, that was the heart of the controversy between the two theories, and it's really delved into in detail in the book. And I would hope you would appreciate the outcome based on that. Trying to reconcile those two opposite theories.
Right, especially, the comment about the road. I enjoyed seeing your photographs, the older photographs. It looks so much different nowadays. It's all forested, but back then it was much more open. So that really helped me visualize what it was like closer to the 1880s.
Yeah, that was one of the hardest things for us, to try to get that feel for what the countryside was back then, because that really tells you a lot about the mindset of the person or persons that did this.
Right. It's
that
a totally
lack of cover.
Yeah, totally different environment.
Yep.
Please advise audience after reading this book to make your comments on Amazon. The authors should be acknowledged for their work solving and writing about the murder. So
Was that a relative of yours? Oh, well, thank you.
I was just going to ask, what is the next project, especially since Monroe was part of Northampton County?
Well, we don't have any irons in the fire right now. I mean, I'm doing murder cases. I have one next month I'm preparing for, and I know Eric is super busy too. But who knows? There's so many oddities and mysteries that we've come across coming out of Monroe County that maybe it's only a matter of time before we take it up again.
Will you be having a book signing anywhere in Monroe County?
We never thought about that.
Well, we could do something at the Shaw Mansion.
Yeah, maybe once all this pandemic stuff clears up a little more, maybe we can do something like that. Sure.
Sounds like a good idea. Another question. What happened to her sister?
Which one? Which one? She had many sisters. Jenny, Anna, Alta. Jenny was the youngest. She actually took care of her mom and dad in the end, and she stayed on the farm. But I think all of them raised families. They appear to have lived full lives. Many of them stayed, maybe not in Monroe County, but in Pennsylvania. A couple went out west. One went down to North Carolina. I know Eric was able to do a lot of genealogical research and sent dozens and dozens of letters out to descendants, and we did get some feedback. We were looking for that one person, that keeps family history and knows all the dates, but we haven't found that person yet. So if that person is there, we're all ears, because we
Right.
believe that with 11 brothers and sisters and numerous grand nieces and nephews, there should be somebody that would have kind of kept track of things.
It was surprising, though, that most of the relatives never even heard of the book. They knew nothing about it at all.
Wow, that is surprising. And the next question, is there any living family members? So there certainly are, descendants, but
There
not.
was somebody actually did comment on the book, and they were related that way to Etna through one of her siblings, and they do remember talking about it. They do remember it coming up, and kind of an awkward thing almost. And they were very grateful to read the book because they were unaware of all those details.
Wow. Well, and this program will put it up on YouTube, so you never
Okay.
know if someone's searching things up online. Who knows? Maybe it's another link.
Yep. Yeah.
This is a fascinating story. I assume there is a relation to Conrad Bittenbender, whose family was brutally attacked by Native Americans during the French and Indian War in this area.
Yeah, Conrad was killed in an attack. In fact, Dave Christine's great-great-grandfather, was it Philip Bossert, was also attacked. And I think Philip wrote a letter requesting troops to come protect the settlers up here, and that started Sullivan's March. They seem to have been related, but not directly. I can't say Conrad was like a great-great-grandfather of Etna. They seem to be separate lines. Maybe if you go further back to Germany, you would find a common ancestor.
Regarding the question about the sisters, the person clarified the two that had found her, the sisters that had found Etna, if you know anything, how they were.
Oh, you mean emotionally?
I guess so.
Oh, I know Etna's mother was never the same after that. Etna's mother grew reclusive. She suffered debilitating arthritis induced by stress, that inflammation. And it, according to the death certificate, it started right around the time of the murder. 30 years she lived after the death of her daughter, and from the information also, she rarely left her house after this.
But we did trace all of the descendants of all the sisters.
Yeah.
Up until now. Some of them didn't have children. Of course, that line ended then. But some had children, and then their children had children. We tracked down all of those people.
We have a couple comments. People are very excited to order their copy of your book, so they're going to go online and order.
Thank you.
What piqued your interest in this case?
Well, you came across it right from the beginning.
Well, I do a lot of the murder cases in Monroe County. I try a lot of the murder cases, and it's kind of like a specialty I have, where I'm always interested in hearing stories like that. And somewhere along the line, I picked up this story, and once I found out who she was, and then I found out where it happened, I saw that there was a mandate by the grand jury to ferret out the killer and use all your resources, and it was addressed to the district attorney. And I talked to David, and I said, I'd like to work on this in my spare time. And Eric agreed, and so it kind of took on a life of its own. It just kind of bothered me that this was unsolved and forgotten for all those years. So it's trying to get at the truth.
All right, and how awful it was.
Yeah.
The details are very, very gruesome, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Clarified if the sisters stayed in the area, asking if the sisters had stayed in the area.
I don't think any of the, we say the area, yes, if you include Northampton County. Yes, if you include Lackawanna County. But I don't think any of the direct Bittenbender line stayed, of the female Bittenbender line stayed in Monroe County. Eric did find, I forget his name now. You were talking to a Mr. Bittenbender, whose, I think, grandfather was either Sylvester or Eugene. Do you remember?
Yeah, we talked to so many people, like
Yeah.
names kind of.
But he was very local to the area because he was still in the Snydersville area, that fellow. Remember him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like you answered all the
Oh,
questions
good.
and comments. Oh, there's another one. Will you ever conduct a tour of all of the different areas?
That would be interesting to do. I mean, we can do that. I mean, we'd have to get permission, obviously, for some of the locations. But I think enough of it is there that might actually be interesting. Something that would be worthwhile.
Good. Okay, well, I think we are done with our questions. Thank you once again for sharing this with us. It is definitely a little bit of a sad topic, but it is interesting and it is part of our history. So thank you for all the time you spent researching this. And I certainly encourage everyone to get a copy of your book, and we'll plan a book signing at some point.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having us.
Great. Have a great evening, everyone.
You too.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.